Thanks so much for showing up. And it's going to be a good time here as we look at the oceans. And boy, there's so much I want to say about that, and I only have 45 minutes. I'm a Navy veteran. I was off the coast of North Vietnam for 2 cruises on the USS Constellation. And so that gives me the authority to talk about the oceans, because I spent about 2 years of my life in the Pacific Ocean. And by the way, I was saved in the Navy. The Navigator Ministry. Have you ever heard of the Navigators out of Colorado Springs? Okay, the Navigators were very active on board the aircraft carrier I was on, and so to make a long story short, I got saved, and then the Lord gave me a very sincere desire to learn about biology. So it was in the Navy that I really wanted to learn about biology after I got saved. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the mighty oceans in the brief time that we have together. And it says in Genesis chapter 1, "And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good." And so when you look at the oceans, we see about 330 million cubic miles of ocean, last time I counted. And it covers nearly 75, maybe 73% of this planet. So they call this what? They call this the water planet, because we are inundated, literally 73% of this planet, with liquid water. And so ironically, what do we call this planet? Earth. What should we really call this planet? Water, you bet. So I'm starting a one-man campaign to change the name of this planet to water. So help me out on that. By the way, the average depth of the ocean is 2.5 miles. 2.5 miles straight down. Now that's the average depth. So there's just a whole lot of water for something like a global flood that hopefully we'll get to a little later in the presentation. This is taken from a weather satellite, 22,000 miles out in space, taking a picture of the water planet. And again, we can appreciate just how much water is on this planet. And here's another picture from the same weather satellite, 22,000 miles out in space, showing just how much water we have on this planet. Now, 2 atheists writing a textbook entitled Oceanography just a few years ago, Garrison and Ellis, had this to say: "The planet must be large enough that its gravity will keep the atmosphere and ocean from drifting off into space." I hate it when that happens. And so we can see the design of this planet with the gravitational attraction and everything else, so that we are experiencing what we have today in this world. So it's not too much gravity, it's not too little gravity. As Goldilocks said, it's just right. You got to say it in a higher voice. It's just right. And not only that, Garrison and Ellis, and by the way, this reminds me of a verse in the Bible, Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, where the Apostle Paul says that God's creation is not only seen, but Paul says it's clearly seen. God's creation is clearly seen. Here's another quote. This is from the Royal Astronomical Society, just way, way back in the year 2019. And they had this to say: "The sheer strength of Earth's magnetic field helps to maintain liquid water on our blue planet's surface, thereby making it possible for life to thrive." Again, this reminds me of Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, where Paul says that God's creation is, 2 words, clearly seen. Thank you very much, Joel. I appreciate that. God's creation is clearly seen. Now, the phrase clearly seen, the Sherwin translation of that phrase is painfully obvious. In other words, it's really clearly seen. So let's take a look at a drop of ocean water. Before I show it, I love to swim. When I get out to the coast of anywhere, I do a lot of what they call distance swimming. And so I have swallowed my fair share of ocean water. So here's what 1 drop of ocean water looks like when you magnify it 25 times. So when you were in high school or college and you used a light microscope, this is low power. 25x is low power. And this is what 1 drop of ocean water looks like. So when you... if you like to swim in the ocean, down the hatch, okay? And it's amazing that I'm here speaking after I swallowed, I don't know how much of this through the years and all. And so, yeah, you bet, take a nice long drink of ocean water. It is delicious. There's more creation evidence that we see in the oceans at the microscopic level. Plankton, for example, supply half of the atmosphere's oxygen. So every other breath that you take is really due to plankton's activity in the oceans, as it has photosynthetic capabilities, takes in carbon dioxide and water, and gives off oxygen. Remember that from high school biology? Oxygen, you bet. And so here are some of the pictures of this oceanic plankton that is so critical in what we call the food chain. Food chain's very, very important, as we all know. So what about the origin of the oceans? In 1859, the Western world was turned upside down by the publication of a naturalist's book in England entitled On the Origin of Species. That naturalist's name was Charles Darwin. As I say, it turned the Western world upside down. Ironically, one thing Darwin never talked about was the origin of the species. He talked a lot about variation within the created kinds. And for example, he talked about wild rock pigeons, and you can breed wild rock pigeons into various other subspecies, which is not evolution, it's just variation within the pigeon kind, you bet. And so one thing Darwin never talked about was the origin of the species. And so let's look at the origin of the ocean. Where did it come from? Secular science doesn't know where the oceans come from. They don't know where the oceans come from. Now, I'm not criticizing them. I'm not condemning them. As a matter of fact, I'm saluting them this morning that they are being intellectually honest in admitting that the origin of water on Earth is still what? It's still puzzling. That was said about a decade ago, but it bears repeating that they simply don't know where the oceanic waters came from. Again, in 2019, this is way back in last year, the source, there's a key word, the source of Earth's water has been a long-standing what, class? Mystery, a long-standing mystery. So just add 10 years to the quote there, and we're right up to this day and today that they still don't know the source of Earth's water. Water, it looks like, has always been here. What does that sound like? Sounds like biblical teaching. Water was not brought to Earth by asteroids or comets, but has been around since the planet was first formed, meteoritic study suggests. And this comes from a quote way back in the year 2020 in some researchers in France. And so the idea was that this planet for millions and millions of years was peppered by cosmic water balloons, as it were, asteroids that contained H2O or water. But water, in this quote, water was not brought to Earth by asteroids or comets. It's been around since the planet was first formed. Let's keep that quote in mind as we look some more at regarding the origin of the ocean. The origin of Earth's water remains unknown, and this was said back in August. And so we like to stay current at ICR. We like to read the literature and share it with God's people. So this is the status as of just last month. Unknown. So secular scientists are suggesting a novel, and by that I mean biblical, a biblical idea regarding the origin. There's the key word again, origin of Earth's oceans. And this comes from New Scientist magazine, and this is about 6 years ago, 5 years ago. How did the Earth get its water, question mark? And then they answer the question by saying, it seems it had it all along. Again, this is very important for the creationist. According to Genesis, the earth began as a watery chaos not that long ago. So water was paramount from when, class? From the beginning. So from the beginning, water was here, according to what Scripture says. And we find secular scientists, again, we're not criticizing them, but secular scientists are being drugged, screaming and kicking to what? A biblical conclusion that looks like this planet always had water. The water that makes Earth a majestic blue marble was here from the time of our planet's birth, according to a quote-unquote new study of ancient meteorites scientists reported, and that was said 6 years ago. So it looks like, again, water has always been here. Genesis chapter 1, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the what class? Waters. So here we find again that God's word is true, and that water was part of this planet when? In the beginning. In the beginning. Isn't that exciting? That's enough to make a Baptist shout. And so the Bible states our planet began cool and covered with water, as opposed to the secular model stating it was molten rock with no water. So you have a choice here, folks. You can look at the evolutionary paradigm that says that Earth was a molten, sterile rock 4.6 perhaps billion years ago, or that God created this planet just thousands of years ago, cool and covered with water. And this is something the Apostle Paul says. I like Paul's apologetic in the book of Acts as recorded by Dr. Luke. Here Paul is speaking with holy boldness before the Epicureans and the Stoics and the atheists and the agnostics, kind of like what we have today. And Paul, with this holy boldness, is saying, and preach unto you that you should turn from these vanities unto, and look at this phrase, the living God. Very, very important words there, class. The living God. The meaning one and only. The living. God is not dead. He is here. He is alive today, as it were. The living God, which made heaven and earth, and here it is, the sea and all things that are therein. Acts chapter 14. So Paul is preaching that God is the creator. He has made everything. And Paul adds the sea and all things that are therein. I thought that was kind of interesting too. And it's not surprising because, again, this planet is inundated with water, 75% water, plus all of the living creatures found in the ocean. And the psalmist says in Psalm 104, O Lord, how manifold are thy works. In wisdom hast thou made them all. The earth is full of thy riches. So is this great and wide sea, wherein all things creeping innumerable, both small and great beasts. And so the psalmist has it spot on, absolutely right on, in regard to how God is the creator of all things, especially in the seas. So that brings us to the blue whale, the largest animal on this planet. The blue whales are massive. How massive are they? Well, their heart weighs over 1,000 pounds. That's a half-ton heart. And not only that, but the tongue weighs 2 tons. Try and say that fast. 2-ton tongue, 2-ton tongue. And so that is a big tongue that these blue whales have. The calves nurse for 7 to 8 months, drinking 100 gallons of milk daily. Now, I'm a zoologist. I study animals, and I'm here to tell you the abdominal mammary slits that are found in the female, the mom whale, are absolutely amazing. Now, think about this. The mom is pregnant. She gives birth to the calf, and they call it the calf, and there are nursing whales nearby that help to push the newborn calf up to break the surface of the sea so it can what? Take its first breath, causing significant physiological and anatomical changes with that first breath. And so then the calf is designed by the Creator to have the instinct to go to the abdominal mammary slits of mom. Now, these abdominal mammary slits are utterly amazing, and I'm here to tell you this morning that zoologists still do not understand the anatomical details of the abdominal mammary slit. Specifically, why is it when the calf takes its first a drink of milk from the mom, it doesn't get a mouthful of seawater? No, it gets what? It gets milk. And by the way, the milk, the chemical makeup of the milk is just exactly right. Just the right concentration of proteins, carbohydrates, water. It all is, as Goldilocks says, just right. And so when the calf goes into the abdominal mammary slits to get that drink, that we still don't understand the anatomical detail, how the calf does it. Here in the 21st century, the zoologists still don't know, but they do not get mouthfuls of seawater. Absolutely fascinating, fascinating design. It reminds me of a verse in the Bible. It's found in the book of Romans, chapter 1, and verse 20, where the Apostle Paul says, God's creation is what, class? 2 words. Clearly seen. God's creation is clearly seen. And the calf may gain 50 pounds per day. Think of that, 50 pounds per day. But I guess that's not surprising if they're drinking 100 gallons of high-fat milk from mom every day. So here's the blue whale heart. This guy is crawling through the heart here. How big are the blood vessels of a blue whale? They're big enough, not only that you can have in some of the larger vessels a person, a guy crawling through it, but some of the other blood vessels from head to toe are big enough, head to tail, that a rainbow trout can swim through those blood vessels of a blue whale. Well, God created the whales. Evolution has maintained land-living carnivores entered the seas around 50 million years ago. Now, we don't believe those timescales for a second, no pun intended, but and became whales called the cetacea. This comes from Michael Benton. He's an evolutionary atheist. He has written a book called Vertebrate Paleontology. He does not believe the Bible, but he says, looking at a great blue whale, this is what we just looked at in the last couple of slides, 30 meters long, or fast-swimming dolphin, he says it's hard to imagine how they evolved from terrestrial mammals. This is one idea from the evolutionary community. How they evolved from terrestrial mammal ancestors, and yet that's what happened. Well, you can go ahead and say that if you want, but this is not a very scientific statement, okay? They're saying that the aquatic mammals, the cetacea is what we call them, evolved from a terrestrial mammal. And the evidence there is sorely lacking. I can assure you it's lacking. And yet, here, Dr. Denton, I'm not making fun of him, Dr. Benton says, and yet that's what happened. Again, that's not a compelling, convincing scientific argument, just saying it happened and pounding the podium just a little bit harder and raising the voice when you say it happened. That's not science. For example, this comes from a quote in Current Biology just 2 years ago. Baleen whales appeared during the late Eocene, but evidence of their early evolution remains both sparse and what? Controversial, okay? So we can say, according to the creation model, that whales have always been whales. There we go. See how easy science is? Whales have always been whales. Fish have always been fish, by the way. And fish are not mammals. Fish are fish. But fish have always been fish, even from the very beginning. Even some of the lowest layer of the sedimentary rock strata we call the Cambrian, they have found fish in lower Cambrian strata. That's right at the base of the geologic column, and 100% fish. And here, look at the structure right here of the baleen whale. You see these? This curtain is made of the same type of material that makes up your fingernails. And scientists call that baleen. And this baleen is exquisitely designed to filter out the smaller creatures that we saw a couple of slides back that I said makes up so much of the oxygen of the planet. And so the whale uses its 2-ton tongue to sweep the baleen on the inside of all the krill and the smaller creatures that it brings into the mouth. I'm just throwing this out here because I love English literature. I read a lot. And this was published in 1851, Herman Melville's famous Moby Dick. And there are whales alive today who were born before Moby Dick was written in 1851. That is amazing. And so I just finished reading Moby Dick. It's a fascinating, fascinating book. Japanese spider crab can reach a leg span of 18 feet, claw to claw, and weigh 40 pounds. It has a gentle disposition and can be raised in a really, really big aquarium. Okay, remember, it's got a, 18 feet possibly? Okay, so it's not going to be the aquarium in your living room there. And of course, the Japanese spider crab is found in Oregon, and where else? Oregon and Japan, see how easy science is? Okay. Oregon and Japan. Now, when I look at this 40-pound Japanese spider crab, I think of two things, class. Two things. Yeah. Those 40 pounds, please pass the hot butter and lemon. Here we have the whale shark, a gentle marine giant. It's the largest known living fish species. And isn't it nice that it is a gentle creature? And probably this is not the creature that swallowed Jonah. We read in Scripture that Jonah was swallowed by a whale or a great fish. It was probably a fish that God designed specifically for that purpose. I like this. Not only does the fossil record show that teeth have always been teeth. Teeth have always been teeth. You can mark that down. You can write it down. When we find teeth in the fossil record, they are 100% teeth. Now, we have incredible variation varieties, such as the crab eater, quote unquote, seal teeth. Look at that. Very, very sophisticated. The most abundant seal species in the world is the crab eater seal, but they don't eat crabs, but instead they use this dentition here, these teeth, to strain krill. So it has nothing to do with eating crab. But we again see how sophisticated the dentition is, just how the Creator has designed teeth. And so remember, be true to your teeth, and they won't be false to you. Okay, and so here's some of the krill that the crab eater seal strains out through its mouth and through the teeth there. Diatoms, diatomaceous earth is found all over the world, basically, especially the White Cliffs of Dover. If you've seen the White Cliffs of Dover, I lived in England for 3 years, and so I've been to Dover several times. And it's made of, this is what we call diatomaceous earth, marine algae with fancy silicate, that is a glass pillboxes full of little grooves and holes. See these tiny holes here? We really don't have the technology to make holes that small, because this picture here is what we call an electron micrograph. It's a picture taken of a diatom using an electron microscope, because this diatom is so impossibly small. And then within this very, very tiny diatom, God has produced these, has made these tiny, tiny holes here. It's very, very sophisticated. And it shouts design. It reminds me of a verse in the Bible. It's found in the book of Romans, chapter 1 and verse 20, where Paul said God's creation is, they're very good, clearly seen, clearly seen. A single sand grain, right here. These are sand grains that are magnified about 25, 50 times. A single sand grain harbors up to 100,000 microorganisms, that's like bacteria, from thousands of species, and that's a single sand grain. Sand-dwelling bacteria play an important role in marine ecosystem. The sand acts as an enormous purifying filter. And so what we find is the oceans are very, very dynamic, and within every 24-hour period, we have specially designed viruses called bacteriophages. It's a big mouthful of word. Bacteriophages are viruses designed by the Creator to attack bacteria. And so you have a very significant overturn of bacteria every 24 hours. So the ocean does not get stagnant. It doesn't get overwhelmed with bacteria, because these bacteriophages, these viruses designed to attack the bacteria, keeps it in check. And so it's very, very dynamic. It's quite an amazing, amazing process. So what are the features of the ocean? Those who go down to the sea in ships, who do business on great waters, they see the works of the Lord and His wonders in the deep. And so what we find are some of these incredible creatures of the deepest parts of the ocean. Remember, the average depth of the ocean is 2.5 miles. What are these two men doing here? Well, this is Don Walsh and Jacques Piccard. This is way back in 1960 when I was years old. And so I still remember when they did this dive down into the trench there. In 1960, Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh and Jacques Piccard descended to the bottom of the Challenger Deep, more than almost 36,000 feet down, the deepest spot in the ocean. And so that was a very, very significant dive that they did. Obviously, nobody had ever been down there before. They got halfway down, and guess what happened? The outer pane of their little porthole cracked. So they stopped. Good idea. And they talked to the individuals up on the ship that was helping to lower them down, and they made the incredible decision, let's just keep going. Now, that outer porthole pane had cracked, and they thought, well, it's going to be okay. And it was, obviously. And so they continued down. They hit the bottom a little bit too hard, not as like it was concrete or anything, but they couldn't see the bottom of there, and it brought up a whole bunch of silt and clay and everything else, particles. And even with the lights, they couldn't see much, but they knew they were at the bottom. They spent 20 minutes at the bottom there of the Challenger Deep before they began their risky ascent. In June of 2020, Kelly Walsh, who was the son of Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh, Kelly Walsh, the son Walsh, retraced his father's footsteps, and he went down as well to the bottom of Challenger Deep. Well, Matthew Fontaine Murray is one of my favorite individuals because he was a Navy officer, and he wrote the first classic work of modern oceanography called The Physical Geography of the Sea, published in 1855. Now, Murray was in a catastrophic carriage accident which caused him to convalesce and recover for several months in a naval hospital on the East Coast. During that time, he read in Psalm 8, "Whatsoever passeth through the paths of the seas." And he decided, laying in his hospital bed, that if the scripture said that there were paths in the sea, Murray was going to find them. Even as he convalesced in the hospital, he contacted his friends who were ship's captains and other individuals in the Navy, and they began to plot out these massive oceanic currents, or if you will, the paths of the sea. So what Scripture said was absolutely correct. There were paths in the sea. And so they called Matthew Fontaine Murray the Pathfinder of the Oceans, and they put up a memorial for him here. And so I thought that was kind of neat. Ocean currents can flow for thousands of miles, and together they create the great flow of what they call the global conveyor belt, which plays a dominant part in determining the climate of many of the Earth's regions. And so here's some examples of what's going on minute by minute in the oceans. And it's very, very important we understand that. How is it that the oceans have these currents? Well, the answer is the moon. We find that the moon is exquisitely designed to be at a certain distance from the Earth. The moon is a certain density, a certain size, a very specific rotational velocity, and orbit around the Earth. So much so that twice in 24 hours, the moon causes the tides, and we all heard about the tides of the ocean. So these tides occur twice in a 24-hour period, moving trillions of tons of water in such a way that it avoids stagnation. And so we can thank the Creator once again. I think it's evidence for creation, don't you? That you would have the moon causing these tides. And moon, do we know everything there is to know about the moon? Not hardly. As a matter of fact, evolutionists don't even know where the moon came from. They have found insects on the moon, which is kind of interesting. Have you known about that? Yeah, scientists are calling them lunatics. Thank you. Thank you. Daily tides caused by the moon help to avoid oceanic stagnation by mixing the waters, bringing oxygen to stagnant pools, and stirring up nutrients. And so this is all the design inference of what we see with the moon and how it interacts with the Earth and giving us the tides that are so critical. Notice that the tides are just right. We don't have tides that are just kind of mellow, just kind of a minor fluctuation, but at the same time, we don't find tides that wash across half of the continent. Boy, I hate it when that happens. But the tides are just right to cause a thorough mixing of the oceans. Our unexplored ocean accounts for 90% of the living space on this planet. So no wonder Paul said what he said in the book of Acts in regard to God being the creator of the seas and everything in them, when 90% of the living space is found in the oceans. What's this called? Don't say starfish. This is called a sea star. So for zoologists, we call this a sea star, not a starfish. And so that's another word to kind of maybe add to your vocabulary, sea star. More than 90% of the ocean biosphere is deep, and most of this remains unexplored. The ocean hosts life at all depths across the widest ranges of conditions, and they represent a huge reservoir of undiscovered biodiversity. It's really sophisticated. I mean, what's this? This is what they found recently. Has anybody been to Fuzzy's Tacos? Okay. How about this? What is that? We know it's probably organic, but that's about as, and it's an invertebrate, but it's very difficult. Plus, they lowered a special cage down 2.5 miles, and a creature crawled in, and then they brought the cage back up after a couple of hours, and you could see that this guy was not happy, and kind of showed his displeasure there. And this has been voted the ugliest animal in zoology. And so, what is that? They even found outside of Monterey Bay up in Northern California, the carnivorous harp sponge. We've only seen 1% of Monterey Bay, said an evolutionist, and it's still one of the most well-studied regions of the Earth in deep water, and they've only studied 1%. So much of the ocean is unknown for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's deep, isn't it? 2.5 miles on an average. But it's also cold. It's right at the freezing point of water. So it's cold, it's deep. It's also dark, pitch black there as you get lower and lower. Plus, of course, the pressure is crushing. Pressure is just incredible. And also it's salt water, so it's very corrosive. So you have all these things working against it. But what's the biggest problem? Who's going to pay for it? So it's one thing to be able to go down there and snoop around and use all the sophisticated equipment, but you've got to have somebody with a pretty thick wallet in order to help to pay for such investigation and research. So it's really not surprising that we have quotes like this. But again, look at this. 2 miles down, this carnivorous harp sponge. It's strange, isn't it? Very weird. We give glory to the Creator who has created these kinds of creatures. And then finally this morning, a Genesis flood. God said in Genesis chapter 6, God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." And so God sent a worldwide flood, of which we have the evidence of what occurred there just 4,500 years ago, we still have with us today in the huge sedimentary rock record containing trillions of fossils. And we like to say at ICR, floods form fossils fast. Floods form fossils fast. For this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. So here we have the Apostle Peter, who spent 3 years of his life with the Lord Jesus Christ. And what did Peter say after his 3-year ministry with the Lord Jesus, spending all that time with him? This planet was covered with water. So Peter is documenting, he's verifying what it says back in the early chapters of the book of Genesis, that there was a worldwide flood. The oceans are composed of Genesis floodwaters that God used to judge a world just 4,500 years ago, approximately. And that flood was a year long, a little over a year long. The worldwide mountain-covering deluge would have deposited most of the world's fossil-bearing rock. So here we have the sedimentary rock units laid down like pancakes, and we find that very graphically in Grand Canyon. I've lost count how many times I've been to Grand Canyon, but I've always enjoyed very much going to Grand Canyon, investigating Grand Canyon, not from an evolutionary perspective that says Grand Canyon was carved out sand grain by sand grain through the tiny Colorado River over 60 plus million years. We don't believe that. We believe Grand Canyon formation is testament to what happened 4,500 years ago. So instead of saying Grand Canyon was formed with a little bit of water over vast periods of time, guess what we say? Just the opposite. Grand Canyon was formed with a lot of water over a short period of time, as we read about in the book of Genesis. And what substantiates the Grand Canyon formation, rapidly formed and so forth? What happened at Mount St. Helens in May 18th of 1980 in the Pacific Northwest. I still remember when that occurred. I was on duty at a city fire station in Colorado when Mount St. Helens blew up, and we just sat glued to the TV between calls watching the drama unfold. Now, we see these fossils that are locked up in the sedimentary rock units. Trillions of fossils are found in the sedimentary rock units around the world there. So if you were to take 100 fossils completely at random, what would 95 of those 100 fossils be if you took them at random, if you were blindfolded? The answer is, as we say in zoology, marine invertebrates. Marine invertebrates. But here it's just us here this morning. Let's just call them clams, okay? So 95% of all fossils that you find in the fossil record are clams. Just a bunch of clams. Lots of clams. Just clams in the bottom, the top, and the sides. Just clams, okay? That means that the remaining 5%, a lot less than the remaining 5%, are dinosaurs and plants and reptiles and amphibians and birds and mammals. All of that is squeezed into that remaining 5%, but a vast majority of the fossils are what? There we go. Genesis chapter 6 through 8 clearly teaches a flood of worldwide extent. A simple reading of these chapters leads the reader to conclude that God had Noah prepare an ark to withstand a devastating cataclysmic event. And here's the key. There are at least 30 statements of the universal character of the flood and its effects in Genesis. God is not the author of confusion, as Paul says in Corinthians. He wants us to understand these very, very critical opening chapters of the book of Genesis as it describes, for example, the Genesis flood. And so here is a record of the flood showing, and this is where we find the first fish. In the lower Cambrian, we find the first fish. It was found in 1996, I believe, in China. And so fish have always been fish. Dinosaurs have always been dinosaurs. People have always been people, according to the fossil record. So we find that not only do floods form fossils fast, but really the fossil record, as you see here, is a record of death, not development. The fossil record is a record of death, not development. The fossil record is a record of extinction, not evolution. Extinction, not evolution. So these rock layers were laid down rapidly as described in Genesis chapters 6 through 8. And this is just one quick quote, and I know we're out of time now, but this comes from just 2 short years ago at Lund University, an evolutionist there. Quote, "But the German ichthyosaur fossils, that is an aquatic reptile, the German ichthyosaur fossils is also unusual in that it appears to have fossilized very what, class? Very quickly, preserving soft tissues before they rotted away." So what's one of the keys to the sedimentary rock units that we find here? We are consistently now, for the last 25 years, finding soft tissue, dinosaur soft tissue. People used to think that's an oxymoron, soft dinosaur tissue. Can you have both? Absolutely. They're finding soft dinosaur tissue. They're finding ichthyosaur, which is not a dinosaur, it's an aquatic reptile. They're finding soft tissue there. What does that tell us? It tells us that how can these tissues remain in their preserved organic state for even 500,000 years? It is just not possible, let alone 66 million years is what evolutionists are saying. No, the soft dinosaur tissue, the soft tissue of the ichthyosaur, is evidence that the flood was recent, just thousands of years ago, approximately 4,500 years ago. And this is the ichthyosaur as we see here. So, one more quote and then we're done right here. A new study shows that dinosaurs and other continental vertebrates remain diverse in Europe up until the asteroid impact. Now, we don't believe that's what killed the dinosaurs. This is the evolutionary explanation. An asteroid striking Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago. When I was in high school, it was, when I was in graduate school, it was 65 million years ago. So it gives you an idea how long it's been since I was in graduate school. Thank you. Now it's 66 million years ago. This is strong evidence, says this evolutionist, that dinosaurs and many of their contemporaries, here it is in gold letters, went extinct rapidly and simultaneously all across the globe. That phrase there in gold, ladies and gentlemen, is just exactly what we're talking about in regard to the Genesis flood approximately 4,500 years ago. The Genesis flood was catastrophic, and the dinosaurs and other creatures, not all of them, because of course we have fish that survived the Genesis flood, went extinct rapidly and simultaneously all across the globe. Floods form fossils fast. Floods form fossils fast, and so the Genesis flood gives us fossils that show up complete and fully formed. Complete and fully formed. And that's exactly what we find in regard to the flood. Well, I have a couple of books here that Joel has brought me. This book is the Ocean Book, and it's been revised and updated. If you've enjoyed this presentation, this book I wrote a couple of years ago while in San Diego, the Ocean Book, revised and updated. And The Wonderful Mighty Oceans is the presentation you just saw on a DVD. And so these kind of go together like hand and glove. The DVD and the book goes together like butter and bread, goes together like politics and corruption. Okay, so you want to get these two books here. And this is a book that Dr. John Morris and I wrote called The Fossil Record. This also has been revised and updated, and so it's pretty much up to date when it comes to fossils and so forth. I wrote the last about maybe 1/3 of this book as I addressed the so-called missing links that evolutionists bring up. And so I went through, took me about a year, painstakingly addressing the so-called missing links that the evolutionists try and tell us is found in the fossil record, and I used secular sources to make my case that these are not missing links at all from secular sources, not creationist. And so you'll enjoy this. If anything else, folks, you'll enjoy the pictures. They have beautiful, beautiful pictures. This is a good coffee table book on the fossils. We love fossils at ICR. And then also it's a good reference book, as I say, about the last 1/3. If somebody says, well, XYZ is a missing link, all you have to do is look in the back of this book and see that that's not the case. And then we have the revised and updated Creation Basics and Beyond for the serious creation scientist. If you enjoy studying creation science and want to get into the meat, this is the book to get, Creation Basics and Beyond. Now, I know that a lot of you, money is kind of a problem here, and maybe you can only get one book. And I understand that. If you just want to get one book, these are the 3 books I'd get, okay? Creation Basics and Beyond, the Fossil Record, and the Ocean Book. This will be a good beginning to your growing creation science library. Okay, Joel, let's go ahead and open up for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sherwin. We'll get to questions here in just a moment, but I wanted to mention a couple of things for those of you watching here in person. Later this afternoon, Mr. Sherwin will be leading a science workshop geared towards kids or kids at heart, talking about the wonders of the human body and some different experiments and activities related to that, so you can learn about our bodies and how God created them. That's taking place at 3 o'clock, so stick around for that. You can find out more information at the front ticket desk if you're interested. And then I forgot this earlier, so let me mention it now, and reiterate this. We are doing a book signing right after this presentation. So when you walk out of this room here in about 5 minutes or so, come over to the Discovery store, pick up one of Mr. Sherwin's books, and then meet us over here by the planetarium. You'll see a table there, and Mr. Sherwin will be there to talk to you, sign your books, answer any other questions that you might have, and maybe you might want to take a selfie with him. All right. Do we have any questions from our in-house audience today? Yes, sir.
Well, there's no top number, I don't think. It all depends on the cetacean scientist who is studying them as to the very uppermost number. So I don't have that off the top of my head. And I do know that they use, for example, tooth morphology and tooth development as it grows. They can get an idea with the growth of the enamel to date a whale. And also they use C14 dating, carbon-14 dating as well in ways that I'm not quite sure of. But I do know those are the two ways that they date a whale. So there's also a shark that has been discovered that is several hundred years old. And it's probably the world's oldest living vertebrate. And boy, that thing do look old. But it's quite amazing just how they're able to survive with all of the pollution that's going on in our oceans, plastics and microplastics and all that. It's really quite amazing. Did I answer your question, sir? I don't. That is a good question, but I'm not sure, again, the upper end there. So I just have to draw a blank on that. Yeah.
Good question. Other questions from our in-house audience? Anybody? Yes, sir.
Does the fact that plankton supplies 50% of the Earth's oxygen, is that any kind of reasonable repercussion to the people that want with the carbon, all the carbon issues? Saying that we need to renew our ways of manufacturing and doing things.
Yeah, I don't know if that impinges so much on the total plankton count of the oceans and the carbon footprint, I guess, that they're talking about. I do know that people, mankind, if I can use that word, doesn't really contribute that much. For example, one active volcano spews out more carbon dioxide and all that than what we have provided since the Industrial Revolution. And so that's just one volcano. And there's, of course, now undersea volcanoes as well that have been found 2 miles below the surface of the ocean. We're finding these undersea volcanoes that are spewing out all sorts of very toxic material from the bowels of the earth. And so too often, mankind is blamed, and there's some reason for that and some of the things that happen with the plastics and all that. But when it comes to the total carbon footprint, we're just a pittance. There's a lot more geologic activity in the form of volcanoes and all that. They're putting in a whole lot more CO2 in the atmosphere. Yes, sir.
Talk about the viruses in the ocean that consume the bacteria and stuff. I was curious, is that a natural phenomenon in the deep water horizon? The Gulf got contaminated and it's going to be a mess for years. Were those natural processes that cleanse that environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you all remember the Exxon Valdez off the coast of Alaska, and the apocalyptic predictions that were being made by the secular scientists that, oh boy, this hydrocarbons washing over the rocky areas of the Alaskan shore, this is just going to devastate the Alaskan ecology for what, decades if not centuries. And so it was well-meaning on their part. I'm not criticizing them, and hindsight is the way it is. They took wands that spewed out super heated water, and they were going around and they were cleaning off the hydrocarbons from the rocky shore using this superheated steam. Guess what? That was the worst thing they could have done. Because what God has created in terms of our environment are bacteria that actually eat hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons is a fancy word for compounds that contain only carbon and hydrogen, like gasoline, for example, and oil. And so there are actual microorganisms, bacteria that chomp, 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 and just eat up and get fat, dumb, and happy eating hydrocarbons. So when they were starting to use superheated steam to, quote unquote, clean up the environment, they were doing the worst thing they could do. They were parboiling all of these creatures that otherwise would have taken care of business. But they learned from that mistake. So when we had the Deepwater Horizon, British Petroleum there in the Gulf, about, 10 years ago or so, and when the oil well blew out at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, yes, there was damage that was done, and there were businesses who were put out of business when it came to fisheries. However, the researchers were absolutely stunned as to how much a role that these carbon-eating bacteria did. They got in there and they began to devour and clean up the spilled oil in record time. It was really quite amazing. Now, yeah, if you look at the results, some of the oil did get washed up on the shore, and I'm not detracting from that at all. We understand there was a big problem, but not nearly as serious as what they were saying, and it was due to these, I would call them, created bacteria in the beginning. So it's really kind of an interesting cleanup program. Did it answer your question? Good.
Very good. We're going to wrap up with one last question.
Okay.
We've got about a minute and a half to do this. So this is from a viewer on YouTube Live. It's one of our friends, Ujan, and he's watching from the country of India. So we've got folks watching this stream from all around the world. And Ujan asks, how did Noah carry all kinds of plants and trees on the ark? Did the seeds survive the flood, or did they get stuck deep in the sand beds and other sediments?
And that is a good question. I appreciate that. Okay, is that all? Oh, no. What they've done is these are one of the rare times that we can actually do experiments, okay? And remember what an experiment is. You can observe and test and repeat. And so creation scientists decades ago would take representative seeds of plants and soak them, what? In brine or salt water for over a year and see if they were still viable. And they found that a number of these seeds were still viable after that time. So that gives us evidence that, yeah, you could have these seeds floating in the Genesis floodwaters that would find land and begin to germinate. And so that's a good question, and it's, I think we've made progress in that. Think about the coconut, too. Coconuts float, and they float to an island, and they germinate and all that and sprout. The coconut milk is really called a liquid endosperm. It's quite nutritious. And so the coconut is able to germinate on these desert islands, of course, as we see as we look at some of these pictures and all. So a good question from our friend in India, and research has been done on that. So